The last time most people saw Bindi Irwin smiling on camera, she looked exactly the way she always had. Calm, warm, controlled. The daughter of Steve Irwin, raised in front of an audience that had watched her since infancy. But what makes her story so difficult once you know the details is that during many of those appearances, she was already living with a level of pain that surgeons would later describe through numbers that are almost impossible to ignore. 34 lesions, then more than 50, an ovarian cyst, severe enough to attach an ovary to her body wall. Multiple surgeries, years of being told nothing was wrong, and what she eventually said makes you go back and look at every interview, every television appearance, every public smile, and wonder exactly how long the gap existed between what was being shown to the world and what was actually true. Because the version of Bindi, as in most people remember, began almost immediately after she was born on July 24th, 1998 in Queensland, Australia. She was not introduced to the public gradually. She was raised inside it. Her father was one of the most recognizable television personalities on Earth. Her mother, Terry Irwin, helped build an international wildlife brand around conservation, television, and Australia Zoo. Even her name carried symbolism. Bindi came from one of Steve Irwin's favorite crocodiles and also from the family dog. The identity was already constructed before she was old enough to understand it, and that matters later, because children raised inside public mythology often learn something very early. Smiling becomes part of the job. She grew up inside Australia Zoo, surrounded by crocodiles, snakes, koalas, handlers, camera crews, tourists, producers, and expectations. Most children learn where cameras are by becoming uncomfortable around them. She learned by becoming natural in front of them. She was homeschooled while filming television content and participating in conservation work. And by the time many children are learning multiplication tables, she was already functioning as a public personality. At 8 years old, she launched Bindi the Jungle Girl. At 9, she won a Daytime Emmy Award. 9 That sequence is deliberate because it established something very powerful, very early. Competence, professionalism, resilience. The public did not see a child struggling under pressure. They saw a child thriving under it, which in retrospect reads differently once you understand how often she learned to perform through discomfort. And the pressure on the family intensified after September 4th, 2006, when Steve Irwin died after a stingray injury while filming in Queensland. Bindi was 8 years old. The footage from that period still exists. The memorial appearances, the speeches, the composure, and people praised her for being strong, but strength and adaptation are not always the same thing. Because while the public narrative focused on perseverance, another story had already begun developing privately inside her body, one that would continue for more than a decade before anyone could properly identify it. The symptoms reportedly started when she was still very young. Severe fatigue, intense pain, nausea, episodes so debilitating she sometimes struggled to function normally. But the most important detail is not simply that she experienced pain. Millions of people experience chronic pain. The defining detail is how often she was told that pain was normal. That word matters, normal. She heard variations of it repeatedly across years of medical appointments and uncertainty. Normal female pain, normal hormonal issues, normal discomfort. And when someone hears the word normal enough times from authority figures, they begin reorganizing their understanding of reality around it. That word was not accidental. It was chosen by people who believed they understood what they were seeing, and over time, it trained her to question herself instead of the system failing to diagnose her. If you have ever been on the receiving end of carefully rehearsed language from someone dismissing what you know your own body is telling you, you understand precisely what that phrasing conceals, because during these years, the public life continued uninterrupted. In 2015, she competed on Dancing with the Stars and won. Millions watched her perform weekly choreography under physically demanding conditions, while she was simultaneously dealing with symptoms doctors still could not explain. And afterward, the public interpretation remained the same: energetic, disciplined, positive. But positivity can become camouflage, and silence can become survival. According to her later interviews, she underwent extensive medical testing over the years, Doctors investigated gastrointestinal diseases, infections, and other conditions. Some reports suggested concerns serious enough to include cancer screenings, yet answers never came. Only repetition, more appointments, more uncertainty, more adaptation, and adaptation has a cost, because eventually people stop asking whether they are healthy and begin asking whether they are simply weak. That's psychological. Transition is one of the most damaging parts of long-term undiagnosed illness. The body hurts. The tests appear inconclusive. People around you continue functioning normally. So the person suffering begins negotiating against their own reality. She kept working anyway. That is the detail that changes the entire story once you understand the timeline. She continued. Filming continued appearing publicly, continued participating in conservation. Work continued becoming a wife and mother, all while carrying a condition that surgeons would later physically document inside her body in devastating detail. And then, in March of 2023, she finally explained what had really been happening. She revealed publicly that doctors had diagnosed her with endometriosis. For many viewers, it was the first time they had heard the word attached to someone they recognized so clearly from childhood. But for millions of women worldwide, the announcement immediately sounded familiar, because endometriosis often operates through delay. Delayed diagnosis, delayed treatment, delayed validation. Studies across multiple countries have shown that diagnosis can take years, sometimes close to a decade or longer. Her timeline fit the pattern almost exactly. And then came the photograph, a hospital bed, recovery, honesty. Without performance, she explained that surgeons had discovered 34 lesions during surgery, 34 separate areas of endometriosis. They also found what she described as a chocolate cyst. Again, specificity matters, because numbers transform abstract suffering into physical evidence. 34 lesions is not confusion. It is documentation. That is not the move of someone exaggerating discomfort. It lands entirely on its own, and what made the response so overwhelming was not just the diagnosis itself. It was recognition. Thousands of women immediately began responding online with stories that sounded almost structurally identical. Years of dismissal. Pain minimized, symptoms normalized. Exhaustion interpreted as emotional instability rather than physical illness. And Bindi Irwin did something extremely important in that moment. She did not frame herself as uniquely tragic. She framed herself as typical. That sequence is deliberate, because it shifted the conversation away from celebrity and toward systemic experience. Suddenly, this was no longer simply the daughter of Steve Irwin discussing health problems. It became an entry point into a much larger conversation about medical dismissal and how often women are conditioned to endure pain quietly. Then the situation became even more complicated, because after the first surgery, additional medical problems emerged. She later revealed she needed another emergency procedure. Doctors reportedly discovered more endometriosis lesions, removed her appendix, and repaired a hernia. Additional reports described the severity of the ovarian cyst and the extent of tissue involvement. More than 50 lesions eventually removed. More than 50. And that number forces a different interpretation of everything that came before. To every public appearance, every interview, every conservation event, every smiling photograph, which in retrospect reads differently, because the body keeps records even when the audience cannot see them. And yet the most revealing part of this story may not actually be the surgeries. It may be what happened afterward. She began speaking publicly in language that sounded remarkably restrained, considering the scale of what she had experienced. No spectacle, no rage, no theatrical reinvention. Instead, she focused on validation, listening, belief. I believe you. Those three words became central to her advocacy. And again, word choice matters. Believe, not fix, not solve. Believe. Because people living with chronic undiagnosed conditions often describe disbelief as being nearly as psychologically destructive as the illness itself. The constant suggestion that symptoms are exaggerated slowly isolates people from their own instincts. She understood that intimately. And what happened next transformed the entire story from personal survival into something larger. Women across multiple countries began sharing their experiences publicly in response to her disclosure. Many described finally seeking treatment after seeing her speak openly. Others described finally feeling visible. Visibility changes behavior, silence protects systems. And suddenly the smiling child people remembered from wildlife television had become something else entirely. Not simply a celebrity discussing health, a translator between invisible suffering and public understanding.